Today, we're joined by Peter Duncan from MicroSeismic. He and several other top industry leaders will be part of an amazing panel happening later this month. Join us for a once-in-a-lifetime event celebrating the stories that fuel our industry. January 22nd, 2026 at the Norris Conference Center. Check out the link in the show notes and grab your tickets now.
Hello, and welcome back to Energy 101. Today, we have a revisit from Peter here. He is our geophysicist, and we are going to get into seismic, and more specifically, microseismic. So I rewatched y'all's episode that was about almost 3 years ago. And
that was 3 years ago?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
And at the end, y'all kind of wrapped up like just talking about everything, and we're just kind of shooting the shit. And you kind of went on a tangent about how it's so cool, like it's such a cool profession that like just doesn't get like its flowers, right? And you kind of compared it to astronauts, like they're exploring the sky, like space and everything, the ocean people underwater in a trench doing, and like it's all, there's movies about it and you see it on TV and it's cool. But these geophysicists are doing the same thing with everything that we can't see underground.
Exploring what you can't see.
And you're right. And here we are 3 years later, and there's still no movie about geophysicists or anything like that. Unless,
how can we make it cool? How can we glamorize it?
How do we make it cool? But, you know, here we are 3 years later. Like I said, no one's talking about it. But, you know, we had to have you back on because I think it's cool. And let's just keep trying.
And you're our favorite guest, so we had to bring you back.
Oh, you're too kind. It's good to be here. And I have to say that I watch many of your podcasts, and I really enjoy them. You always seem to make people feel relaxed and get to the real heart of the matter rather than rattling off the standard stuff. But geophysics is cool. You're absolutely right. Geophysics is cool. And when I first went to university, and I have no recollection of what we talked about the last time, so I'm just going to freebase.
I love it.
It's a good thing. It's a good thing.
But when I went to go to university, I knew I liked science, and I knew I didn't like chemistry because my father didn't like chemistry. And my father was one of those guys who had listened to Lord Kelvin, who said, there is only one science. It's physics, and everything else is stamp collecting. And while my father didn't really push me to physics, he did buy me a physics set when I was about in grade 7, and we did all the experiments. But he didn't push me to physics, but he steered me a long way from chemistry. You can do anything you want, but don't do chemistry. And I never had much affinity for biology. That seemed a little wet and messy. And so I just kind of went into general science. But the fun group at the university I went to, which was in Eastern Canada, were the geologists.
They were the fun group.
They were the party group. The reputation was, if you wanted to go to a party group and still be science, then go to geology. And 2, the geology department always managed to guarantee that all of their students got good summer jobs out in the field, doing practical work, which is, and I think to this day, I think was one of the best things I ever did, because too many students or applicants that I see these days come in and they've never done anything in the field. They've never touched a rock or whatever. So anyway, I went into geology because I was going to get a good job, and it was with some fun people. And I did. I had a fabulous job that after my first year, and I'm going to date myself by telling you that was 1970. And I went to Newfoundland to work on a copper exploration project that was being developed by a Chilean company.
Oh, cool.
And they were doing diamond drilling small holes, not big oil and gas kind of rigs, but smaller holes down to intersect where there might be copper, and we'd bring them up. And kind of my job was to split the core and package it up and send it away to get assayed for how much copper is there in it, and that sort of thing. But along the way, they sent this geophysicist into the field to do some work. And since I was the grunt, right, the first year student, I got to go be his assistant. And we were doing what they call induced polarization. It's not seismic, but it's like seismic in that we send a pulse of electrical energy into the ground, and then measure the reflections from in the ground and interpret whether there's ore there. So if there's a conductor like copper in the ground, when you send a pulse in, it lights up and it sends a pulse back. And you know it's there, and you can interpret where is the copper. And if there's nothing there.
Can you even tell the depth of the copper?
The depth and the width, and maybe even something about how much copper, what grade it is. Because if it's just weak, you get a weak signal. And if it's strong, if there's a lot of copper there, you get a big signal. So my job, and it was dangerous. But when you send this pulse into the ground, what you had to do is have a long antenna. So you'd have one place where you injected current in the ground over here, and way far away, a couple of 100 yards away, you would have these copper pots that were full of copper sulfate that were the other set of electrodes. And so the geophysicist who knew what he was doing would go he'd be at one side of the line, and he'd have all of the controls. And my job was to be at the other side of the line and put these copper pots down, and then let him know that my hands were no longer on it. Because if my hands were on it, I'd get a shock when they send the pulse. And so, but he was, so I did this for a little while.
What kind of shock are we talking?
Knock you over on your butt shock. Okay. Because you're trying to drive current through a lot of the ground. I don't know, lethal, but maybe knock you out. Knock you out. If the ground's wet and you're sitting on it and you're holding onto these copper pots, the electricity might decide you're a better conductor than the copper pots are, and bang. Anyway, funny story. He was from Europe. He was from Europe. Yeah. And so we're in Newfoundland, and we're sitting, there's cut lines, and I'm sitting looking at him so that I can know when he's turning on the current. And we've got radios. So he's sitting, and he's just down the lip from a hill. And I'm sitting across a little bit of a valley and looking at him. And he's hunched down with his back to the hill, reading the instruments. And this black bear comes stepping up over the top of the hill and down the line, and is coming down the line, walking towards him as he's sitting reading his instruments.
He's locked in. and he's from Europe.
So he's not a guy who knows too much about bears and things like this, okay? And I see the bear, and I get on the radio, and I go, Roger. His name was Roger. I say, Roger, don't look now, but there's a bear coming up behind you. And the radio clicked. And when the radio clicked, the bear heard the radio, and the bear stood up. So when Roger turned around, there about 30 feet behind him was a black bear standing up on its hind legs and looking at him like this. Probably couldn't see him, could hear and maybe smell him. Well, the equipment that Roger had went one direction, Roger went the other, and the bear went the third. And I'm sitting there laughing. And that convinced me that I wanted to be a geophysicist. No. But,
the dangers.
But what was a true fact was that guy, being classically educated, and every night we were in a field camp, so we didn't have much to do. And he showed me how to take the equipment apart, how to put it together, and how to interpret the data. And to me, as you said a while ago, geophysics is about seeing into the earth what you can't see. Geologists hold rocks in their hands, and I thought I was going to be a geologist. But geophysicists use fancy toys to see what the geologist can't see. And a wise man once said to me, and forgive the misogyny, but he said the difference between boys and men, or men and boys, is the price of their toys. So here was a chance to do treasure hunting with really neat, state-of-the-art toys and get paid for it, and go out to the field and go out in the woods and chase bears and do all sorts of neat stuff like that. So when I went back to university in the fall of 1970, I went to the head of the department, the geology department, and I said, make me a geophysicist. And geologists probably considered geophysics a sub-discipline of geophysics. So it wasn't as if he was offended by this. He thought, well, that's neat. You want to specialize. It's still a geological discipline. And I'll tell you what, they went out of their way to design a hybrid program for me, which was a mix of the math and the physics and the geology that you would need to be a geophysicist. And they let me do this program. It wasn't one that was scripted, and it got me a really good footing. I got jobs every summer out doing geophysics and worked underground and did all sorts of neat things, and then went on to graduate school. But it all started because of Roger and the Bear and led to a career that I don't think anybody could compare. And you mentioned that geophysics is neat and people don't make movies about geophysicists. And they really do, because any time, geophysics is just treasure hunting with neat tools, with neat toys. And anytime you've seen anybody doing anything in a movie that has to do with finding oil and gas or treasure hunting or anything else, if you've ever seen any of the films about trying to find Blackbird's treasure up in Nova Scotia, they use geophysics to look down to try to find that. The FBI and the CIA, they use geophysics to find where drug smugglers have buried their treasures, their dollars, or where
gold hunting shows,
or where the caves are, or the tunnels underneath the Korean border, or from Mexico up into California for smuggling drugs. All of those disciplines where you're doing remote sensing is geophysics. And in fact, if I were to think about radio telescopes exploring the universe, well, what I do in MicroSeismic is effectively make an acoustic telescope that's just like that and uses exactly the same data processing, but I put it downwards. I point it downwards, and I focus that antenna. And you could think of it as a dish microphone. It looks like it. When we lay our geophones out on the ground, they look like the spokes of a wheel. And what I do in the computer is steer them to focus on different points in the subsurface. And I'm not using electromagnetics. I could. What I was using in Newfoundland was electromagnetics, but what I use is sound, because sound will go a little bit deeper into the earth. And I can use that sound and bring it back. But I'm just exploring the universe below me as opposed to the universe above me. But it's all geophysics. Well, I said I couldn't imagine a better career. So you play with toys, you look for things of value, and you get to travel the world. I've been around the world a couple of times. I haven't been to every continent, but I'm going to fix that. But I've been to every continent except Antarctica, and I've done work in them. I've looked at data in them, and I was president of the SEG in 2003, 2004, and that's kind of what kicked off my world travels. And in that, when I was doing that, I got to travel around the world, particularly to go to different sections of the SEG, Society of Exploration Geophysics, to meet different sections, to give lectures or talk about the SEG or whatever. But what I found was that I traveled the world, and everywhere I went, I found a community of geo-nerds who liked to fiddle with toys and think about the math and the physics. And I'm not a mathematician, but think about the math and the physics and the joy of discovery and the joy of being out in the field. And it's just been a great career, huge. And it's a shame that more folks don't really get introduced to it at a young age, or at a younger age, where they can have that chance, because it's a tremendous career.
Yeah, I love that you call yourself a treasure hunter.
I'm just a treasure hunter.
I love that. I'm glad you kind of touched on the difference between geologists and geophysicists, because that's a question I always have. Even though I think you probably told me last time on the podcast, I forget.
That's all right. Well, at one point in my career, I started off doing mining. And even after I got out of graduate school, I was working for Shale, and I was doing mining exploration. And I got stationed at a tin at a tin prospect that Shell was turning into a mine down in Nova Scotia. And I was kind of the project manager, so we were doing geology and geophysics to outline the deposit so we could figure out if it was big enough to be a mine. And it turned out that this deposit was what they call, I'm going to get a little technical here, but is what they call a hydrothermal deposit. So what happens in the earth, the earth is, we got this crust and then these deep rocks, the hot rocks from depth, they bubble up, really bubble. They bubble up into the crust, sometimes go all the way to the surface and make a volcano, but a lot of the times they just sort of stop halfway up and get buried underneath and form these bodies that we call batholiths, but they could be granitic, and a lot of the stuff that you put on your tabletops is cut out of these batholiths from down in Brazil or whatever. But what happens when these hot rocks go up, they heat the water that's in the crust around it, and that water seeps up around the outside edges, and it actually leaches out of the country rock that they're intruding into the valuable minerals. And in this place I was, this tin deposit was one of these geothermal deposits, hydrothermal deposits, and on the edges were little veins of gold.
Wow.
So people would go out actually on the weekends and pan for this gold. I never did.
Like real gold?
Yeah, real gold. Yeah, not fool's gold, real gold. So I tell this story because the rock that the batholith came up into that it leached the gold from was called the Maguma Group. And when Shell decided to sell that mine and move me back into the oil and gas business and said, you are now an oil and gas geophysicist, I went back, but I carried my rock samples with me. And one of the rock samples was the Maguma Group. So now I'm going to kind of cast shade on some oil and gas geophysicists who do not have maybe the same affinity for the rocks that I had developed or that got me into it in the first place. But I go back to Calgary and I'm signed to do seismic to find oil and gas offshore Nova Scotia. And I'm in my first meeting where people are putting the seismic sections up on the wall. And sections, these are these acoustic sections that are like an acoustic image. Think of it as an X-ray down of the earth, but it's a two-dimensional picture, a slice in the earth, and it's just where the sound waves have bounced back. And once you kind of get into it, you start to see the patterns and you can intuit the geology. Anyway, this section had this green line on it that was the deepest that oil and gas could occur. They called that basement. And they had written on the side, Maguma Group. And I'm listening to the geophysicist talk about his exploration. And I said, what's that green line? He says, Maguma Group. And I said, Maguma Group? My God, just a second. And I ran down the hall to my office and I grabbed a piece of the Maguma Group and brought it back and laid it down on the table. And I said, Maguma Group, green line, Maguma Group.
Were they excited?
I was kind of disappointed in their response because mostly what they did was look at me like I had rocks in my head, which I did. But anyway, so seismologists, yes, we're different than geologists or geophysicists. A lot of geophysicists are different from geologists. In the end, we're trying to intuit or infer what's going on in the earth, what the earth looks like down there, making an image of it. And we use pattern recognition. I mean, I love it today, everybody talks AI, right? Well, geophysicists forever have been doing pattern recognition or machine learning or AI in their heads, and then later with computers, by looking at what geology looks like. What does a salt dome look like? If you have an outcrop or a rock, a road cut, what does a fold look like? And so we look at those patterns, and then we look at our seismic and say, oh, that's the same pattern. So that's a salt dome, or that's a rock fold, or that's whatever. So we're doing pattern recognition to interpret. So all seismologists, all geophysicists have to interpret their data in terms of geology. But not all of them get to go out and actually hold the rocks in their hand. Sometimes they have to just depend on pictures that they've seen in books and things like that.
Which is kind of disappointing. I feel like it'd be cool if you can
I think
touch it.
There is value. And certainly when I went through my basic training at Shale, the whole point was they took you out to see the rocks and then took you back to show you what it looked like in your seismic section or whatever other section you were using, and allow you to do that inference or that inversion of the data that you collect to create an image. But these days, so much of it is done by computer, and that oftentimes the students don't get a chance to practice those very basics and fundamentals. They depend an awful lot on the computers to do it, which has made it faster and cheaper, probably better in a lot of cases, but maybe not quite so much.
Not as
fun.
cool.
Yeah, not as cool.
Maybe not quite so much fun.
Yeah.
But it certainly, the career, we're kind of waxing poetic about the career here, but geophysics, particularly geophysics for the oil business, up until probably the dawn of some of the financial computing or maybe the data centers today for AI, has always been one of the biggest users of computer technology and right on the forefront of developing data processing for doing machine learning or pattern recognition or anything else. We have always been involved in that kind of enterprise. And sometimes it's not talked about because it has, defense kind of applications. One of the more famous geophysicists in the world, from before my time, if you can imagine, was actually a guy called Norbert Wiener, who worked at MIT on one of the very first computers that ever existed. And what was that work done on in the beginning? To develop radar and locate airplanes during the Second World War. And in fact, if you go back even farther, during the First World War, the Germans, a guy named Luger Mintrop, developed ways of listening to the vibrations on the surface of the earth to locate where the enemy's artillery was.
Oh, that's interesting.
And then he founded a company to do exploration using that same technology and came over to Oklahoma and made the first discovery in Oklahoma of oil and gas using that same technology.
Wow.
That's so cool.
People don't talk about this, but these things are all related.
Yeah.
And when you start to, for me, I find it fun to kind of see how it built on one step at a time and became more and more critical.
Mm-hmm.
But even the Mars lander had a seismometer on it and a thumper that they thumped and recorded the signals to try to image the inside of Mars.
Wow, I didn't know that. Did you know that?
No, but we did learn about thumpers recently.
Oh yeah.
And that technology that Mintrop used, that I said, is exactly the same as elephants use to communicate. Elephants sense the waves in the pads of their feet, and they can tell where it's coming from and maybe even communicate. We're not quite sure what the language is.
Yeah, they can sense like miles away, right?
Miles away. Because the Earth is phenomenal. And it's one of the reasons that we seismologists tend to use sound waves, seismic, just the German word for sound, sound waves rather than electromagnetics or whatever for the deep or the long distance exploration, because the Earth transmits sound very, very well. I'm sure you've been in a pool underwater and how the sound travels underwater. The hotel over here, I'm not sure it's still there, but there was a hotel that when you swam in their pool, they pumped sound into the water, and no matter where, it was really loud underneath.
That's so cool.
And I worked one summer, 1972, I think it was. I worked underground in Sudbury, Ontario, in a copper mine. And there I learned just how well sound traveled. You could be, say, at the 1,200-foot level, and someone at the 400 or maybe 600-foot level could drop a hammer, and it would sound like it was right next door to you.
Wow.
The sound would just travel through.
But you hear it like 20 seconds later.
There's certainly a delay. It wouldn't be 20 seconds, but there's certainly a delay. But it's exactly that property of dense materials like the Earth that earthquake seismologists used to image the interior of the Earth and find out that we have a solid core, that oil and gas geophysicists use to image to find out where to drill, and that I use in my microseismic practice. See, I'm bringing it back to microseismic. That I use in my microseismic practice to listen for where the Earth has moved, to be able to create a different kind of image than conventional oil and gas 3D seismologists use. So you might ask me, well, what's the difference between conventional
You read
seismic
my mind.
and microseismic? Conventional seismic, I talked about that section that we had on the wall with the Maguma group. In conventional seismic, it's kind of like an X-ray or an MRI or just a photograph. You're creating a static image of the Earth to see all of the structures, the containers, where the oil and gas might be or where there's minerals or things like that. If you wanted to know how things changed over time, you might take an image and then go back a year later and take another image and see what the differences are. They call that 4D seismic because of the time as well as the 3Ds. But what I do is take a dynamic image of the Earth in real time. And these salt domes and things like that, they're not moving in our time frame. They move over tens of thousands or millions of years. But the San Andreas Fault, when it moves, it's moving in real time. And when it moves, it creates a sound. And my whole practice is hearing that sound and then telling where it is, when it went off, and how the rocks moved. So I'm taking a dynamic image. And I probably used this analogy before because I always do, but conventional seismic is to microseismic as an ultrasound is to a stethoscope. So the ultrasound can see something interior. Okay, if you repeat it over and over, you might see the baby breathing or something like that, or its heart, but you're doing 4D seismic then. But with a stethoscope, the doctor's just listening to your heart and inferring what's going on by hearing the sounds. And that's what I do. I listen to the reservoir. And if the engineer is doing fracking, hydraulic fracturing, to create a pathway for the oil to escape the rocks, then I map where those cracks are, the snap, crackle, pop, to know where to harvest it. If they're doing geothermal work, which is getting to be talked about a lot more these days, and rightly so, I think it's a great source of energy. But when they're doing geothermal, they're drilling down into the really hot rocks. There's geothermal that are heat exchangers up shallow, but that's domestic. If you want industrial level, hundreds of megawatts that can power communities, you need to drill down into the really, really hot rocks that are 200, 300, 400 degrees. And those rocks, since they're deep, and they are those batholiths I was talking about, actually, they're impermeable. The fluids won't flow through them. So what do? You frack them, just like we did with the hydraulic fracturing for the shales. You frack them to create cracks that the water will flow through and harvest the heat. So you create a heat exchanger. And that creation of the heat exchange chamber through fracking then allows you to flow water through the batholith, harvest the heat back to the surface, and create electricity. And in fact, this is one of these ironies. I don't know if it's an irony, but I think we talked about sort of how things build upon each other. Back in the late 60s, early 70s, the topic of the day, the new topic of the day in the energy world was geothermal. Because back then, we all knew that the rocks at depth were hot. And we all knew, remember this is around time of the oil embargo and things like that, that we had to find other ways to produce heat or produce electricity. And windmills hadn't really got invented yet, at least not to the extent they are now. And natural gas was something we flared because it wasn't worth anything yet. And hydro, we were running out of rivers to dam. And the geophysicists and the geologists said, look, we can drill down deep, we can create fractures, and there's hot water down there that we can harvest the heat. And so the governments got really interested, just as they have been over the last few years in carbon sequestration. Geothermal in the early 70s was the carbon sequestration of the day. It was the sexy topic.
Not only that, they probably thought like, oh, okay, this is where we're going. This is where everything's heading. Everything's going to be based off of geothermal in the 80s. And obviously,
it didn't work.
We learned all the restrictions with that.
So they did, and the governments around the world sponsored about 15 massive projects to try to learn how to do geothermal. And they drilled the wells, and what they found was they didn't have the drilling technology, and they didn't really understand how to create that heat exchange chamber. But they did do something that was really significant to me. All of the MicroSeismic technology that we used in the shales, that I practice today, was developed during the work on these hot, dry rocks trying to create geothermal heat exchange chambers. And they didn't work, but not because of the MicroSeismic. They didn't work because we didn't have the technology to drill the wells and frack the rocks. Well, go forward 30 years, and people start drilling better wells into shales. And by now, the geothermal projects have all pretty much been put on ice. They start drilling, and the engineers start to learn to drill long horizontal wells in hard rocks. And then they start fracking them. And they develop the fracking processes that are current today by doing microseismic monitoring, using the microseismic from the geothermal practice and creating the images. And I'll tell you, when we started fracking shale wells back in 2005, 6, 7, we were doing open hole fracks. That is, the whole well was exposed all at once. And then we started going to different stages where we'd block off and do maybe 3 different stages in a well that was 1,000 or 2,000 feet long. And what the microseismic showed was that all you were doing was putting the energy into the weakest part of the rocks, and you were leaving a lot of the rock unfracked, unharvested. And so microseismic, now again, this is the geothermal technology, taught the drilling industry in the shales and the fracking industry in the shales how to better position their wells and how to better do their fracking. And then the shale business hit the fan, right? And kind of stopped, and my microseismic practice went down the tubes. But some of these unemployed drilling engineers who had made their chops or learned their chops in the shale business said, well, wait a minute, we've got a whole new technology now that we can apply to geothermal. And so they started doing it. And they've shown that it's being successful. There's a project up, there are 2 projects now up in Utah, in the valley there, where one is a government-sponsored research project and one is an industry-sponsored commercial project, where they're using shale technologies to create heat exchangers down deep, and they're still monitoring it microseismically. And so it's gone whole circle from microseismic being developed to support geothermal to it supporting the shale to now going back to the geothermal, and everything that we learned in the shales is being applied to geothermal. And it looks like it's going to be successful.
Yeah. Yeah. I always find that. I didn't know that it took stuff from geothermal back in the day that drilling did, but I know now we use a lot of drilling techniques in geothermal, which is always cool.
Drilling techniques that were developed for the shale.
Yeah.
But that were steered dare I say, the microseismic industry was responsible for the development of those practices. I'd like to think that. Anyway.
Yeah.
We'll give you there's a lot of full circle moments, and we can easily transition into CCUS and all the salt domes you mentioned earlier. That's all connected, right? But I do want to talk about geothermal one more time, because the big limitation with geothermal is that it's super easy in certain parts of the earth where the mantle crust is closest to the surface, right? Like that's why Iceland is such a big spot when it comes to geothermal.
Yes.
And then, there's parts of basically like nowhere in the US is even close, right?
Not true.
Not true?
Not true at all.
Okay.
And in fact, the limitation on where you can do it is cost, as you might imagine. So if it's shallow, like in Iceland, where it's just sitting on the surface of the earth, then it doesn't cost much to harvest the heat. But that heat at the surface of the earth is really not hot enough to be driving the turbines in the way that you need to create electricity. Now, if you look at the U.S., there's a really lovely piece of work that was published by Stanford back, I think it was in May or June. A guy named Roland Horn, and it's a lecture that's available.
I'll pull it up in the edit here if I find it. Yeah,
it's on the Stanford website, and he did a broadcast and highlighted the advances that the geothermal industry, particularly a company called Fervo, which is based here in Houston, a company called Fervo, the advances that they've made in reducing the drilling time and the cost, and increasing the efficiency of circulating water by doing better fracks and bringing it to the surface. And Roland's student, whose name is difficult for me, but I know they call him Jab, but that's a shortened name for his name. Anyway, in this lecture, they show the potential where the heat is shallow enough to be able to be recovered at a good cost, at a commercial level in the United States at the drilling costs before Fervo's latest results, and then after. And if the after from the 2024 results, and I think they've done better even since, it's expanded where geothermal can be commercial from just along the San Andreas Fault and down the Rio Grande Valley and somewhere up in the Basin and Range provinces to almost half the United States. And what makes it also better is that if you can put these commercial deposits closer to a marketplace, then that's kind of a double whammy that makes it even more commercial. So really, there is a lot of potential. And I think to just continue this, just one more comment, I think that the Fervo guys have proven that they can drill wells to get the operating costs down, that they can frack these wells to get the operating costs down. The one thing they haven't proved is over the long term, as you circulate the water and harvest the heat, will the heat be regenerated fast enough? And that's why you need to go deep, because if you're too shallow, you cool down the reservoir too fast. So you need to go down deep so that the heat keeps in there and you have a constant supply of heat. And I think that might be the one thing we have left to prove. But after that, it's Katie bar the door, geothermal away.
All right. Yeah, I've been trying to find someone actually from Fervo to come on to talk about geothermal. And then there's another company called Quaise.
Yes.
I've been talking to them. They sound like they're on the final front of like where we are right now with geothermal.
So Quaise, I'm no expert on Quaise, but I have read a little bit about them and seen a couple of talks by them. They're a drilling technology. So they're out of the East Coast, MIT, I think, and they're using a really fancy I would call it a laser-based drilling technology.
Hell yeah.
It's all about reducing the cost of drilling, right? And so Fervo is still using conventional drills to go deep down into these hot, dry rocks. And they've made marvelous progress on reducing the drilling time. Quaise is trying to do better, to drill down into rocks that are even deeper, and to do it more cost effectively using these hybrid plasma drilling techniques, if you like. It's actually a plasma.
Good marketing terms. Lasers, plasma.
Oh, yeah, really good. And now, to my knowledge, they've certainly shown that it can be done in the lab, and they've certainly shown that it can be done in shallow wells. I don't know if they've done a really deep test yet, because when you get down deeper, there's all these issues about removing the cuttings and stuff. And at that point, I've exhausted everything I know about Quaise.
That's fine, because we're talking about MicroSeismic. Why don't we get like a rundown of kind of like what your company industry does when you're out in the field? What exactly are you doing? What are you benefiting? Is it necessary when it comes to the drilling process? If we're going to talk oil and gas, at least.
When I first started the company, I wanted to do, I had some intellectual property that I had purchased for shares, so it's on the come. I made a deal with this professor who was a MacArthur Genius Grant Fellow, and he had some intellectual property that he developed over his career, largely directed at mapping deep in the earth, like mantle, crust, core deep in the earth, and interestingly enough, doing detection of nuclear blasts. So working for unaligned people to see whether the Russians were setting off nuclear bombs or the French were, or whatever. Because again, the sound waves travel through the earth and you can see where it happened and when it happened and how big it was and all that sort of thing. So he had this intellectual property. He was getting old and he wanted to see if he could monetize, if he could find some way in his retirement to take advantage monetarily of what he developed. And I was his guinea pig. I made a deal with him and said, okay, we're going to take what you've got, we're going to scale it down to the oil field, and we're going to take this ability to detect where sounds are created and what created them and use it in the oil field. And I wrote down all the things I thought I could do with it. And there were ideas like tracking drill bits or knowing when a fault is going to move that might cut off a well and cause an environmental disaster, stuff like that. I made up a whole list of things that you could do. And I put hydraulic fracturing on the bottom and put a big red X through it. And I said, ooh, hydraulic fracturing, that's supposed to be nasty. And there are other people who do it. And so I don't want to do that. Turns out within 3 years, that's all I was doing. As I alluded to earlier, when people started hydraulic fracturing in the beginning in the Barnett or up in Canada, they really didn't know what was going on in the subsurface. And they had some pretty weak models of how the rocks were going to break. What MicroSeismic provided was the first opportunity to see how they really were breaking. And we learned very quickly that the methods they were using were not particularly efficient. And as I said, it started off where they would just frack the whole well 1,000 feet longer as just one open job. Whereas today, in a well of that same length, they'd probably do it in 100 little pieces so that the fracking would take place over every 200 or 300 feet rather than just one or two places over 3,000 feet. How did they know that? Because we were watching with MicroSeismic what was going on. We said, no, look, you're missing all of this rock in between. You need to treat it more regularly down the well. So we, in the beginning, were teaching the hydraulic fracturing, the completions people, how they needed to attack their well to create a better frac. And now that was sort of, if you think of it, laterally down the well. At the same time, we could see how far out from the well the fracs were going. And so we could tell them, well, you've fracked out 300 feet. Your next well location should be 300 feet plus 300 feet so that you can frack back. So early days, we were worried about the problem of creating fractures down the length of the well. Then we started worrying about making sure that you got all of the rock in between your wells, so knowing what your well spacing was. And then they started to drill these wine racks where the wells were here, like out in West Texas, in the Permian Basin, you've got thicknesses of reservoir rock that are 4,000 feet. And so you don't harvest that with one well. So we could tell how far up the fracks were going and where to put the next well in the vertical section. So that's kind of how the business developed. And of course, wells were getting longer and da. But then the business matured, certainly in the United States, and fields were getting drilled up a lot more than in the beginning. In the beginning, you had one well, and you were trying to make as much as possible of that well. And then you'd start to put pads out of 4 or 8 wells, and how should they be apart? How far should they be apart? Then vertically. And now they're infill drilling in between to try to harvest everything they've missed. And nasty things started to happen. We had what we called fracture-driven interactions, where a well that had already been drilled would be a hit by the fracks coming from the new well.
It's called a frac hit, right?
Frac hit, yep. And our business, certainly in the States today, you were asking what do we do in the oil field today? Our business in the States today is less about making a better well and more about not hurting the neighboring well that you drilled 6 months ago. Because it happens and people don't talk about it. But we have, well, I have one experience where a company drilled 8 wells and 5 of them got sheared off by the neighbor. And I'll tell you what, it's a career limiting thing to be the engineer in charge.
Yikes.
And have your $8 million well get sheared off so that it has no value.
Can you explain just real quick, like how destroyed is it when that happens? Is it completely useless or just a little less?
It's the whole continuum. It goes all the way from the frac coming across and just causing a constriction in the well. And that constriction, sometimes they can bang out, they can drive a tool through it and sort of knock it out and it's not a big deal. To it's a constriction where I can't get past it. And so I lose the well from there on, but I still got this part of the well. To being it sheared right off. And if it's sheared right off, if it's at the heel of the well, you lose the whole well. So it can be a whole continuum. And it actually can go the other way too, or on the other end of the damage that you can have. You can have one of these fracks come and hit a well and not so much shear it off as have the sand, because they're putting in proppant, right? They put in sand to hold the fracks open. Have the sand from your new well go in and fill up your old well.
Oh, no.
So it causes it to not produce for a while, and you have to clean it out, and it costs money, and da-da-da-da-da. So when you're hitting the neighboring well, it can most of the time be a bad thing, and it can be a little bad to a whole lot bad.
And you can't see any of it because it's all underground.
Oh, I can see it.
You can hear it.
I can see it with sound. That's right. I can see it with sound.
Oh, God. That stressed me out just there.
Good thing you're not an engineer.
You don't know that. All right. Well, we could talk forever, but we covered a good chunk. And we have a whole another episode with you to even get more. But even with those two combined, there's still room, right?
Always learning. Yeah.
Well, I think, yes, always learning is a good way to stay young. And a very famous geophysicist used to say, as long as you learn one thing a day, just learn one thing a day and you can take the rest of the day off. So we've talked about a lot of different things. Maybe you can take the rest of the day off.
I'm going to take a week off.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. You want to ask any more questions?
No, I think I learn really well from you because you're able to tie it into stories and it's very visual, and thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, we didn't ask a lot of questions because
we didn't need to.
We didn't
you
need to.
Explained it. Yeah.
I'm not sure that's a good thing. I mean, maybe I didn't talk about what you wanted to talk about, but I'll tell you what. I promise that if you think of some more things you'd like to ask me, I'm happy to come back anytime.
Okay. We'll listen back. And if we come up with anything, we'll definitely write them down.
You bet.
And it'll be like, yeah.
Also, we could do like a little, you have a rock collection. I think we got to see it, You got to bring it here. We go check it out and we do a little like,
yeah.
explain it. What was the
Maguma group.
The Maguma group. I want to see this Maguma group rock.
I think my wife might have thrown out all my rocks. Move enough times and
they're heavy.
They're heavy. Move enough times and you get it becomes a boat anchor. And you need to get rid of it. Particularly, if mama says you have to.
Yep.
All right.
Anything else?
I have a lot more, but we already came out. We went in and we came out. So we'll have to just come back a third time.
As I said, I'd be happy to. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.